Okay. So, as you can see from the title page, I was expecting to get through 6 tonight, but I just wasn't quite able to do so. So, I call it Watch Your Step, but what I really like about this chapter is the emphasis on God. So, since I said there's an emphasis on God, the question would be, how many times is God mentioned in this passage? Oh, and please give me a moment. I forgot to actually print my notes for tonight. Oh, boy. Okay, so anyway, believe it or not, this probably has God mentioned almost as much as any other passage in the book. And the first thing I would do if I were teaching was to just ask the students to go through and count and figure out how many times God is actually mentioned in this passage. In the English, my count is 11 or 10, depending on your version. And a little later in tonight's session, I'll explain to you why that differs. But if you have a King James version or a Revised Standard version, you're probably going to get 10. And if you have a modern translation like the NASB or the NEB, you'll get 11. Now, technically, verse 1 of chapter 5 is actually verse 17 of chapter 4 in the Hebrew. But we can tell that there's a break in the subject matter. And actually, in this case, the English chapter makes more sense subject-wise because the teacher starts with a different approach. Instead of just telling a proverb, or instead of saying, I have observed this, which he's going to when we get, way down at the end of the chapter, what he does is he starts right off with a commandment. He tells them what to do instead of those observations and reports. So right here at the beginning, the teacher's giving us straight talk, particularly about worship and about God. So I'd also like to point out that the Hebrew uses the generic name of God, Elohim, instead of using God's personal name, Yahweh. And I would ask if anybody had any ideas as to why that might be. And not hearing anybody jump up, I would point out that
I talked about that last time in my class, I think when I taught. Yes, in generally, it's referring the God, but not the God is the Redeemer God, like the one in the New Testament. It's different. God. The covenant God. It's that I mentioned that in my Cantonese Sunday school.
But what the point? The point is, it's probably the audience is probably meant to be not just the Israelites, but all nations. So that's why it's the Creator God rather than Yahweh, the Israelite God. Okay, so,
good. But between the two of you, I really like your answer. Obviously, it's the same as mine, and that is because Elohim is, as Dr. Wong said, the Creator God. So the very first time we're introduced to God in the Old Testament is in the beginning, God, he created the heavens and the earth. And so it is used whenever you're talking about God in general. But I really liked what Jenny said in that Yahweh is the God who has a personal relationship. And he is the deliverer God, the rescuer God, the savior God, the God who gets involved in human relationships. So the creator God is the transcendent God. He's way up there. He's distant from humanity. And we're even going to see that in this chapter when the wise man says that, hey, the reason that we should be careful is because there's a big distance between heaven and earth, and God is in his heaven. So it emphasizes transcendence. Whereas Yahweh, this is God who gets his hand dirty because he creates humanity out of the soil. This is God who walks along with humans. This is God who identifies himself as the Redeemer, as the warrior God. But this is God who is actually involved with people. So we have God who is distant and God who is imminent, as I pointed out. If we had God who was only distant, then he would be of little earthly relevance, and we would end up, probably drifting into deism or something. And if God were only imminent, only close, we would take him so for granted that he would be treated just like one of us. So Qoheleth deliberately chooses the God who is transcendent, even though they're the same God, to emphasize the importance of respecting the distance between God and humanity. As Chun Young Sao said, the common issue in these verses is one's attitude before God, with Qoheleth counseling caution, reverence, restraint, and sincerity. So, lest you think that Elohim, which can mean gods plural, meant just the generic gods, I point out that in this chapter, 8 of the 11 times, it's used with the definite article. And the definite article, the, means one. So he's not saying, pay attention to the gods and be careful with the gods. He's definitely saying, pay attention to God. So literally, the Hebrew says to pay attention to or watch your steps. And in some versions, you'll get the word step instead of steps. So it'll be just like our English colloquialism, watch your step, watch what you're doing here, or the next step we take in action would be. Now, in the scriptures, the idea of guarding, watching, observing one's foot or one's feet can either be positive or negative. So, on the church website, I will provide a Word document for you with a list of scripture verses that talk about guarding one's steps, one's path, or one way. And it will also have this little grid where you could put in where the references go. But, I'll give you a hint to show you how they kind of divide. In Job 23:11, this is a good thing. In Proverbs 1:15-16, watch your step that you don't go negative. In Proverbs 4:12, watch your step that you do the right thing. In Proverbs 4:27, watch out that you don't step into evil. In Proverbs 5:5, watch out that you don't go the wrong way. Same in 6:18 and 19:2. But in Psalm 1, it's both. Take the good path and watch out for the bad path. In Psalm 119:1, have your step, have your way, do the right thing. And Psalm 119:101, stay on the good path. So what we have is the Hebrew uses it both ways, and I wanted to go through this exercise to kind of show you that it's balanced. So watch your step can be a warning, but it can also be advice or counsel. And so when it says, guard your steps or watch your steps as you go into the house of God, it's both saying, watch out, make sure you're right, but it's also saying you should be careful and go that way into the house of God. But primarily, even though these are evenly balanced between positive and negative, in the context of worship, this is much like we begin our worship services by singing that the Lord is in his holy temple. We don't literally mean that the Lord was in his holy temple, because God's temple in Jerusalem was very likely destroyed before Ecclesiastes reached its final form. And also, we don't literally believe that God inhabits buildings today, one building more than another, because we know God can be anywhere. But even for us, we need to show carefulness and respect and sincerity when we draw near for worship. So the idea, of course, is to be careful, to watch where we're going. That means pay attention to our intention as we go to worship. Pay attention to what we want to get out of it, what we're trying to do as we approach God, lest we do what this guy is doing, fall down the stairs and faceplant because we weren't paying adequate attention to what God wants. So when we get to the last part of the verse, we read that when we draw near to listen, we need to respond to God because it's worth more than the fool's sacrifice. What is the fool's sacrifice? Well, in one sense, the wise man is drawing from the sanctuary of silence tradition, which said that within the sanctuary, when sacrifices were conducted, silence reigned, fostering a sense of divine presence and human receptivity. The sacrifice had to be done in silence to show respect. But you know what I think? I think that modern worshipers, especially those in performance-oriented churches, need to pay attention to this admonition. We should come to church expecting to be challenged by God instead of being focused on our ability to perform or entertain. Church isn't supposed to be community theater for frustrated actors. Church is supposed to be an encounter with God. I agree with Xiao that the problem isn't approaching God. Qoheleth isn't against approaching God. The problem is approaching God without preparing and approaching God without paying attention to what God had already said. And there's a double tragedy in this. First, we miss out on gaining precious insight to what God is saying. And second, we make ourselves look foolish and God seem trivial. I like the summary statement that J.H. Wright gave. If you're going to plant your literal feet in the place where God is worshiped, you'd better make sure that your metaphorical feet have been walking in the ways that God has commanded. We'd probably also be safe in tying this sacrifice of the fool to other scriptures. The one on your screen, Psalm 40:6-8, tells us it's sacrificing things without having God's will planted in your heart. In 1 Samuel 15:22, Samuel rebukes King Saul by saying, God values obedience more than sacrifice. Hosea 6:6 says that God values loyalty over sacrifice and the knowledge of God over burnt offerings. And Micah 6:6-8 talks about doing right to both God and humanity as being preferable to sacrifice. Even in the 19th century, a commentator on this text observed, The warning is about mere ceremonial self-righteousness. Ceremonial self-righteousness. Looking good instead of being good. Now, as for needing to listen rather than making worship being about ourselves, I want to share a personal experience. When I was in the magazine business, I had the privilege, or possibly the ordeal, of sitting in on several meetings regarding startup companies, mergers, and licensing. And in one such meeting, one of my partners was asked a question of what he saw in the future if this acquisition went through. Now, not hearing the real question, which was, what would we be able to do together that we couldn't accomplish apart? He answered with a tone-deaf response about what this would do for his financial security and his personal future. Well, watching the body language on the CEO and the COO in the room, I jumped in with a vision of where the magazine could go and how it would interact with units in the larger corporation as a result. And when I jumped in, the CEO and the COO with whom we were negotiating looked strangely relieved. Now, if I hadn't turned that discussion back to the future of the business, I don't think the deal would have gone through. Well, if reading the room is vital in human interaction, just imagine how vital it is for finding out what God wants. So that's why the wise man goes on to say that the fools don't even know they're doing evil. Fools think they're okay, and they enter God's presence with overconfidence. But the wise prepare carefully to enter God's presence. The fool speaks too quickly. He just can't wait to say what he thinks or what he feels, and speaks without adequate preparation for thought. And the fool is impulsive. The fool speaks up without thinking of the cost or the implications of what the fool is saying. I mean, I wish I had $1 for every time I've seen a church conflict develop because a member, without thinking about what might have happened before in the church or who would actually do the work if they did it, said, you know what? We should do this. That's impulsive. Without having a plan, without knowing the history, just to say, let's do this. And the fool is one who speaks impulsively. And the fool also speaks too much. Did you ever watch an interview? Oops, excuse me, I'm out of order here. Did you ever watch an interview on television where you really wanted to hear what the person being interviewed had to say, but the interviewer kept interrupting to make his or her points? Isn't it frustrating? And you wonder why they brought the interviewee in as an expert in the field or a celebrity that people wanted to know more about, if they were just going to waste time with the host's interjections. I really hate it when the guest clearly knows more than the interviewer, and the interviewer still acts like the animal that Balaam rode in the book of Numbers. Qoheleth is making the point that God, from his heavenly perspective, knows far more about what we need and what we're facing than we do. So why should we squander our time at worship by running off at the mouth instead of listening? So Qoheleth makes this emphasis between our earthly perspective and the heavenly perspective that God has. But it's kind of strange because before we get to the fact that the fool speaks too much, it talks about dreams. Why do dreams come into play? Well, obviously because prophets have dreams and seers have dreams, and one of the ways that people have mystical control over people is to interpret their dreams. Even in modern life, as you see in the picture, Freud interpreted dreams as being the unconscious wishes of the dreamer, and that's probably partially true. Domhoff said it's a reflection of waking life, and certainly I can tell times in my dreams where something that's happened to me or about to happen to me that I know about gets some kind of symbolic representation in my dream, sometimes literal. In fact, I may have shared with you that when I was taking my preliminary exam in my doctoral degree for my archaeology section, I was really concerned about that test and studied really hard. And as I was dreaming that night, I dreamed I was answering all the questions on that test. And guess what? Those questions were on the text the next day. And I think God, through the dream, gave me the answers to get me through that thing. Because even though I learned a lot in archaeology, I'm not sure I really quite earned the PhD in it. So nonetheless, I'm saying it was a gift. And Jung said it was compensation for the way that we hadn't developed all of our brain, and that's an oversimplification, and I'll just leave it there. And Hall said it was part of a cognitive process, and it's true that our subconscious does work through a lot of things while we are sleeping, if we allow it to, and that's one reason why we should lift up our concerns to God before we go to sleep. But the truth is, dreams require explanation. They require interpretation. And they are often used by false religions and false prophets to try to justify what they're doing. What God wants is for us to hear him clearly and not listen to the fool who may be interpreting dreams and sounding like he really has a lot of knowledge, like these idiots who are always setting a date for the second coming. Basically, they're fools. And, the Bible makes it clear in this regard that at least in that fashion, they are fools. So then the next 4 verses are going to have a lot in common with the New Testament, even though they don't sound like it at first. Verses 4 and 5 correspond rather nicely to Deuteronomy 23, 21, and 22. So in verse 4, when you make a vow to God, don't be late in paying it. Fits right in with Deuteronomy 23, 21, and 22. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, don't delay to pay it. And it is better that you should not vow in verse 5 than to vow and not pay. And in 22, if you refrain from vowing, it won't be a sin in you. Now, Qoheleth says it's better not to vow than to make a mistake in your vow. And Deuteronomy just wants you to know it's okay not to vow. Don't feel the pressure to pledge something that you may not be able to afford. And if that sounds familiar, it's probably because in Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, he says, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or on earth. Jesus said, don't do it. So Deuteronomy says it's not a sin not to do it. Qoheleth says it's better not to do it. And Jesus says, don't do it at all. So why do you suppose that is? What do you suppose they were up to? Before I get there, I can't help, but I think the best illustration of this, and forgive me if you were in any of the sermons where I used it before, is my dad's old preacher story about the farmer who got all excited in a revival meeting, and he pledged he would sell the first calf that was born in the spring and donate all the proceeds to the church. When spring came and the pledged calf arrived, he decided he needed the proceeds to invest in the farm. But he didn't want to face up to his broken promise, so he just quit going to church altogether. So many years later, one of the brothers visited him and convinced him to come back to the revival meeting they were having that night. So he agreed, and he hitched up his wagon, and he headed off to church. But he was a little late getting there, and the singing had already started. And in fact, what they were singing was actually a gospel hymn that went, "There is joy unspeakable and full of glory, and the half has never yet been told." But because of his guilt, he heard it as, "The calf has never yet been sold." And he was so ashamed, he turned his team around and headed home, wondering why those people couldn't forgive and forget after all those years. But for me, though, the real danger of vowing is that we don't know what things are going to be like when the bill comes due. So we may be as presumptuous as that businessman in James 4:13-15. Do you remember? He said, "Come on now, those saying, today or tomorrow we'll go into this city and will accomplish a year there and sell profit. However, you don't know what tomorrow will accomplish. What is your life? Because it's vapor, visible for a little while, and then it isn't visible. Against this, you should say, if the Lord desires, then we shall live and accomplish this or that." That's James 4:13-15, my translation. But do you notice how that idea of the vapor and what we don't know fits right in with the ideas in Ecclesiastes? In fact, this bit, we should say, if the Lord desires, then we shall live and accomplish this or that, is much like what we're going to see at the end, where it talks about how life is a gift from God. We just can't know what's going to happen, but we can't use that for an excuse. Now, do you remember that first part of our study when I said that some versions mention God 11 times in the chapter and some only 10? Well, verse 6 is the one where that happens. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, translated the word messenger as God, because sometimes the messenger of God is clearly identified with God himself. Now, some other translations, like that one by Symmachus and that one by Theodotion, weren't quite so bold, but they hedged their bets and they made it messenger of God. And that, of course, is a phrase that means angel. So there are some versions that put angel here. That could be true, but most Hebrew manuscripts only have this word messenger. And apparently, in Qoheleth's time, there were people whose duty it was to check up on people who hadn't fulfilled their public vows. Tremper Lomlin calls them a religious bill collector. Now, this might have been the priest who was in charge of hearing confessions, as in Numbers 15, or in Leviticus 4. Those were all related to unintentional sins. So the temptation here that's listed in this chapter may well be for somebody to say, well, yeah, I made that vow, but it really wasn't intentional. I really wasn't planning to have the problems that I've had. The temptation would be to tell them, you just miscalculated, or business hadn't lived up to your expectations this year. But Qoheleth says, that's worse. You're lying to yourself and you're lying to God's representative. And since God is so much higher than ordinary humanity, Qoheleth wants us to realize that God's transcendence counters that vain, very human tendency to proliferate weasel words. As Brown said in his commentary, words by which human beings cleverly shirk their moral responsibility or leave room for manipulating the deity in consonance with their own selfish goals. Well, God isn't playing games with us when we try to manipulate God and God allows our stuff to be destroyed. So Qoheleth shuts that door of thinking that God's playing with us or that we can manipulate God by urging us to keep God in awe enough that we realize the destructiveness of ignoring God's will. This destruction isn't God stomping on our toys like an angry parent when we've left them lying in the way. Instead, the destruction comes about as a result of ignoring the truth of God's reality and trying to make our own. So to underscore that point, in verse 7, it begins with the conjunction because. And in Hebrew, the word for because sounds like this: ki. And if that sounds like the English word key, it's very appropriate. Even though some translations translate it as for, because makes a better emphasis. And in this case, the because clause is very clear. The because clause is because in many dreams and in many words there is vapor. Instead, fear God. Don't get hung up in a cult. Don't get hung up in a trend. Don't follow a fad. Instead, fear God. That is the absolute point. Now, I've read a lot of commentators who tried to interpret this and translate it in very different ways because the Hebrew is very difficult here. But I think my old professor actually offered a slice of wisdom when he wrote it like this. The first part of verse 7 is very difficult to interpret. It seems to be a warning against a religion which consists in a multitude of futile dreams and words. And there's his quote in case you wanted it, although it'll be in the notes too. There was a musical on Broadway about gangsters in New York City of the early 20th century. And at one point, one of the toughest gangsters, who has been losing at dice all night, states that he'll only pay up after playing around with his dice. And when the others see the dice, they complain that the dice are blank. There are no numbers on the dice. But the gangster says, "This is no problem because I have the dice memorized." Now, when the musical is played, the audience laughs because they know there's no way that anyone can know what the real dice rolls would be if the sides are blank. The other gangsters are required to pay up or receive money based on whatever Big Julie, this gangster, says. Well, what it seems like in verse 7 here is that Qoheleth is giving us a little bit of skepticism about other religions and how that the interpretation of dreams can be both wordy and contradictory. In other words, the sides of the dice for divination are blank and somebody else is making it up. One is often at the mercy of the interpreter. For example, think about it. In the Hindu interpretation of dreams, flying birds are unlucky, but singing birds are an omen of good things to come. Who's to say? It's like looking at modern art. One critic thinks it means one thing and another something else. So Qoheleth brings us back to something foundational, something we can depend on, trust in holy God. But just because we can trust God doesn't mean we can necessarily trust the bureaucracies of human government. Violations of justice are seemingly routine at any human level of strata. We have two cartoons here representing bureaucracy. With one of them, we just keep getting layer after layer after layer after layer of government bureaucracy as the guy goes down the hall. In the other one, we have that tendency to have more people watching over what's supposed to be done than actually doing it. Wouldn't it be a lot more helpful for this fellow digging the hole to have those people helping? But this isn't a modern problem. This is a human problem. These levels of bureaucracy have happened, since ancient times. It's a social stratification of civilization, and it's sustained by bureaucratic indifference and complicity. We can see it in the ancient empires. We can see it in the Greco-Roman eras. We can see it in the colonial eras, and we can see it in our era. Qoheleth may be claiming that if there were even any possibility of appeal or advocacy on behalf of the poor, it would just end up in a bureaucratic quagmire. But it's even worse than that, because the Hebrew word that's used in these verses is gah-BOH-ah. And gah-BOH-ah, has at least three levels of meaning. One of them is high. So some interpreters translate this as administrative official or bureaucrat. And so when you see that one high one or one administrative official is watching over the other, it suggests that, you can't just deal with one person. You've got to deal with one person, which is one person, which is one person, this stratification that takes place. Actually, if you just take it as administrative one, some interpreters try to make this positive. They try to say that, well, if you've got one administrator watching over another administrator, then maybe there's some accountability. And that's the nice theory, of course. But, the question is, as Seneca put it in his satirical play, who is watching the watchers? Because we tend to notice that as bureaucracies get bigger and bigger, that corruption becomes easier and easier. And that leads you to the second level. gah-BOH-ah can also mean arrogant one, which would suggest a person who could corrupt at any angle. And it might suggest that the arrogant one is looking for chances to cheat other people, while other people are looking for chances to cheat him, while other people are looking for chances to cheat him, and other people are looking for chances to cheat him. And that certainly isn't very optimistic. And the third level suggests a payment taker. We don't know if that's a legitimate collector or someone who takes bribes, but I kind of lean to the last one, that someone who takes bribe. So if it means a government official, it suggests layers and layers and layers in which everyone gets their cut. If it's arrogant ones, it suggests that human greed just goes on and on. And without God's intervention, it's hard to argue with that. And if it's a payment taker, it suggests bribes upon bribes. Now, that's the usual state. And that's what we see in the bulk of this verses 8 and 9. But at the end, in verse 9, Qoheleth must have seen some examples of good governance, because verse 9 says that a king cultivates the land and actually contributes to production is an advantage to the land. And guess what that word is? Advantage. It's that same word for profit or advantage or edge that Qoheleth has used in questions like the one in chapter 1, verse 3, and what we see later in chapter 16 of this chapter, when it says, what is the advantage to him who labors grievously for the wind, for nothing, for a wisp, for vapor, for emptiness? Well, it sounds real cynical in 1:3, and it sounds real cynical in 5:16, because the answer expected is no, there's no advantage. But we're talking about for the person. With regard to the king, if he's actually being productive, then he benefits others and he benefits the land. I think subtly, by using that idea of advantage in the way that he has, Qoheleth is telling us that there isn't really human advantage in doing stuff for yourself, but there is advantage in doing something that builds something for others. That's why when he goes to the parable he's going to tell, and when he starts talking about the problem of riches, it's extra tragic that the rich man has nothing to leave, the formerly rich man has nothing to leave to his son. Okay, the next section kind of shifts gears in verse 10. because now he gives us back to back to back Proverbs. Verse 10 tells us that the one who loves money can't be satisfied with money, nor can he be satisfied with what money buys. It's absurdity. It's emptiness. It doesn't last. And then, as you can see from the charts on the screen, verse 11 is a proverb on economic futility. You might even see the wage price spiral and the consumer inflation cycle, even a little bit of supply and demand in it. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what's the advantage to their owners except to look on? And so that's pretty much the supply the demand thing, because the costs are going to get higher, but the rewards are going to get smaller. If supply is greater than demand, the prices go down. And even though the owners have extra supply, they don't gain anything from the extra. Qoheleth says, all you can do is look. And one commentator says, all you can do is count what little money you have. But I think basically it's really just moving. You become a helpless bystander instead of a mover and a shaker. But verse 12, on the other hand, goes positive. So we have -10, -11, and +12, because it notes that work is meaningful, even if you're not appreciated. And it notes that you're better off working, even if you don't feel well off, even if you don't feel like you're getting all the value that you could. On the other hand, wealth can, of course, be a form of security, but for some, it only increases anxiety and worries compared to a simple, uncomplicated working life. The more you have, the more you worry, and that produces sleepless nights. Now, perhaps in view of the second part of the proverb, caused by indigestion after overeating. So, negative, and positive, but with a final warning that the rich man has this anxiety that may cause them indigestion and sleepless nights. Ever noticed, how many celebrities need that drug regimen just to be able to sleep? And that's a problem, because there's lots of anxieties. There's lots of feeling that you have a lot to lose. There's lots of feelings that things may change and be out of your control. Speaking of which, verses 13 to 17 provide us with a cautionary parable. Actually, in this parable, I think you're better off to read the 15th verse first, because it sounds a lot like a prose restatement of Job 121. Job said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Now, as verse 16 will recap, that this story is a grievous evil, says Qoheleth. And it seems unfair that humans go from nakedness to nakedness, from helplessness to helplessness, often with little to show for it. But in our parable, we're starting off hearing that our person has a hoarding problem. And it clearly says that hoarding is to one's detriment. And there was a case of two brothers named Collier in New York City, and they owned a multi-story building in New York City. And they filled it full of everything. They didn't have to work. In fact, they didn't need to leave the building. But as you can see on the slide, they couldn't bear to let anything go. In fact, one brother was crushed and died under one of these newspaper stacks and some other junk. And it was days before the other brother found him. Let's face it, too much is too much. And worse than that, the desire to acquire more leads to trying to take shortcuts, and that can lead either to bad investments because they were premature, or you're so anxious to get that profit that seems guaranteed that you find yourself open to fraud. Some investments are simply too good to be true. Now, we don't know what this was in verse 14, a bad investment or a fraud, but we do know that this person we're talking about had no legacy to offer his heir. In the ancient world, that was a tragedy. Because the worth of your life, the significance of your life, was judged on what you passed on to your male offspring. Yeah, misogynistic, I see, but yeah, that's the way it is. So verses 15 and 16 epitomize the statement of the late John Stott, where he says that he saw this lady who attended the funeral of this extremely wealthy man. But he had no apparent heirs. And the lady was curious. So she asked the question, what did he leave? Wondering exactly what his estate was. And the person just answered with a scowl on their face, everything. He left everything. So even though it seems unfair to come full circle from naked to naked, what John Stott said was, since our lives are spent between two moments of nakedness, it's best to travel light. Now, verse 17 sums up what happens when you labor for the wrong priorities. You're often unaware of good things because you're in the darkness of your obsession. In addition, you become easily irritated because, as in the verses we quoted from James earlier, you can't be sure what's going to happen. And since things seem so unfair, you end up resenting the things and the people that you can't manipulate. So darkness, irritation, anger, and resentment are spelled out in verse 17. So, as John Stott said, since our lives are spent between two moments of nakedness, it's best to travel light. Fortunately, Qoheleth suggests an antidote in the final verses of the chapter before he goes into a very skeptical section in chapter 6 that I'll try to go through for you in a video that I'll upload on, well, no later than Saturday. It may seem too superficial for us, but these verses certainly affirm what R.B.Y. Scott wrote, to accept life as God has given it and to respond positively to that gift of life is his form of faith. Now, as with earlier sections where Qoheleth has said carpe diem, seize the day, or it is best to just accept this and do this and to enjoy it, we need to understand that what he's talking about is a humble, not just acceptance, but enjoyment of life. And he starts off in verse 18 saying, I've observed this. Here's what I've seen to be good and appropriate: to eat, to drink, and enjoy myself in all one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him, for this is his reward. Being able to eat and drink to survive, and being able to work and be satisfied in our work is a gift from God. Now, that's kind of a two-edged sword. You know, as Christian Ginsburg said, not only is there nothing left for man but present enjoyment, but even for this, he's dependent on God. So for those people who hear Qoheleth as being kind of negative, well, I guess all we can do is eat and drink and enjoy our work as best we can for the few years we're living. You know, it definitely sounds like somebody complaining and grumpily groaning, right? But said, even this is a gift of God, no matter how few years that we have, no matter how much we struggle for the eat and drink, no matter how hard we have to work. Basically, it is a gift from God. It is our reward. Now, sometimes God blesses you. I remember when I was talking to my middle son and, telling him that he needed to get his act together or he wasn't going to, be able to accomplish in life what he wanted to accomplish. And he just came right back and he says, Dad, do you think it's as easy for everyone as it is for you? Because his perception was that I had always gotten what I wanted and I'd always accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. Well, what I can say is I haven't always gotten what I wanted. I haven't always accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. But what I have, if it seems good, it came from God. And it's a richness, a grace gift, a blessing that God has given. And so God has empowered those of us who have a little more. God has empowered those of us who really enjoy our life to rejoice in our labor and understand that it's the gift of God. And we don't even worry about what our life is going to be because God keeps us occupied with the satisfaction, the joy, the gladness in our heart. So, however skeptical you may feel that Qoheleth is, here's what he's saying. Take what you can get. Enjoy it. Do what God gives you to do and take satisfaction from it, even if it's extra hard. And recognize it's a gift from God. And don't resent those people who have more. Don't resent those people who seem to be happier and more satisfied than you are, because whatever God's given you, you need to learn to become satisfied with and to follow him. So, I think verses 18 to 20 here are an appropriate place to stop tonight, because we see on the one hand the folly of riches that are for yourself, and on the other hand the glory of living, flourishing in life, because you understand it as a gift from God. Now, Qoheleth makes no bones about the fact that there's injustice in society. He makes no bones about the fact that some things in life are unfair. But he says what we've got, we need to celebrate, worship, if you will, as a gift from God. So, is there anything that you would have liked me to cover in this chapter that I did?
I got a couple of questions.
Okay, good.
First, regarding the house of God, the Chinese always translate as like the temple of God. Okay.
Yes.
Even like before the temple was built, like Psalm 23, the David's Psalm, right? David never built a temple, but
right.
he at the end of the Psalm 23 is that he dwell in the house of the Lord, right? That's definitely not the temple, because David died before the temple was built by his son. So
the word is literally house in
right, and because the King James version used the house of Lord, but whatever the original word, but the Chinese translation is not. I don't know how to translate the house of God in Chinese translation, but the Chinese usually they're kind of respectful of the house of God, and then they use the word temple, kind of. Okay, so but and you also mentioned that it could be the final edition of Ecclesiastes could have been way after the temple was destroyed. But so the house of God is essentially wherever God dwells, or
yes.
wherever you worship God, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So and then you mentioned that this chapter 5 started with commandments. I am not sure. Is that what you said? I think you said it's
yes. Watch your steps.
Right.
As you draw nearer to the house of God.
But
and then listen or hear rather than offer sacrifice.
Right, but it could also be an advice, a wise advice rather than a commandment, because if Ecclesiastes is the wisdom literature, it could be offering advice because of all the things we said, that you better watch out for this and that, and now you better watch out, if you are in the house of God. It's not.
Well, at least the first one is definitely in the imperative command tense in the Hebrew.
Yes, I understand it's an imperative, but imperative, I always think of this often. It's like, say, like Jesus saying, do not be anxious. People say it's a command. And imperative does not mean command, right? It could
yes, it does.
Wise. Well, I mean, in that sense, but in not the sense of commandment like the 10 Commandments. Okay, so that's the point I'm trying to make. It may be wiser to be, careful with your step, careful with your words, and then commandment in that sense is if you don't do it, you be dead. Rather than you're not wise, you be a fool. You be foolish. If you don't do this. And that's my point about commandment versus an advice.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Although ironically, in Hebrew, they certainly have a tradition of where you better watch your step in the house of God, because remember that Nadav and Abihu got burned up because they were being careless in the house of God.
Yeah, I understand that could be, say if it is in the Torah, it would be, commands. But if in the wisdom literature, would we think it's less in the sense of an absolute commandment rather than something is wise to do, like you will be stupid.
Right. Well, commands can be warnings, and so I think this is kind of a warning, and I just, it was an imperative form, so I automatically assumed it was a command.
I know it's imperative. It's definitely different from, okay, well, it's they like different from the previous 4 chapters. Definitely, I definitely agree that this is the tone is different. Okay, so you better do this rather than, well, it's all vanity. Okay, so
Exactly, and do this to keep from wasting it all. That's for sure.
Okay.
Well, yeah, both of those are really good points. Anybody else?
Because I think of, a lot of this Jesus sayings and in James saying, those wise wisdom things rather than commandments to me. Say like, be anxious for nothing is, if you're anxious, you are dead, and in that sense, right, be joyful, otherwise you be dead, in that sense, I think, let's say like I don't remember which gospel said, Jesus said that here someone is wiser than Solomon. He's talking about wisdom rather than just commandments. I think there are a lot of wisdom sayings in the New Testament as well as the Old Testament that are not commandments. That's how I see it, okay? Because if I say, be not anxious, otherwise you are dead.
Yeah, well, I think you may be perceiving commandments as a little too negative there, because I see that commandments can be positive, but I hear your anxiety over, just going with the full on do this or else. I don't think I ever pictured Jesus's commandments as do this or else. I perceived it as do this because it's the truth, and and that's what'll work for you. So it is, in that sense, it's truth. It is wisdom. And remember, Jesus is the Word, and the Word is incarnate wisdom. So it's a good fit together in that way. I had another point to affirm that followed up on what you were saying, but then it just went outside of my slightly drugged mind.
Oh, another question about the that is still on the first. Let me see. The first few verses is about the I think the let's see, the King. I have the King James version and the Chinese two versions, right? Is the actually the first verse, the fool consider not that they do evil. I'm not sure it is about their sacrifice is doing evil, or because they're doing they think they just, if they sacrifice, you give sacrifice, it it doesn't matter what they've done is evil, or is that the sacrifice itself is evil because they don't do it right?
For they don't know they're doing evil is the best I can do in terms of translating it directly from the Hebrew. But my understanding was, remember, the good sacrifice is doing the will of God in your heart and doing what God wants you to do. The evil sacrifice is living however you want and then pretending to offer a sacrifice to God. So the fool's sacrifice is the thing like we were talking about in Hosea 6:6 and Micah 6:8 and the 1 Samuel 15:22 and the like, and that that's the one that pleases God. So the sacrifice doesn't please God would be the one who doesn't live correctly, doesn't live the way God wants them to. But I got to tell you that every commentary debates for paragraphs on this passage, and then they usually end up coming down to say, well, the full sacrifice is probably related to what I just said, but like in the Masoretic text that I have, it says, because they don't know doing evil. I mean, they don't know they're doing evil, or they don't know to do evil, or some even translate it that way, and that King James translation is certainly very awkward. But if you take it as an infinitive absolute, it becomes because they don't know doing evil.
I think of the Cain and Abel, right? The sacrifice, right?
Yes.
Cain's sacrifice was not acceptable. Is it because his deeds are evil? That's why his sacrifice was not accepted. It's not because his sacrifice itself is right. So is
exactly.
Kind of similar idea here, maybe.
I think it definitely is, and it's a lot like that that light little quotation that I gave you that talked about if you were going to put your literal feet in the house of God, you better make sure your metaphorical feet have been in the right places. So if you're going to literally come to worship God, you better make sure your life has been living as God wants you to. So really, it's underscoring this. But the fool doesn't even know they're doing it. I mean, they're just totally insensitive to what God really wants. I don't think Cain realized he was doing evil when he offered the sacrifices. Oh, I'll just get this out of the way, and God never talks to him about what he gave. He never complains about the grain or the vegetable offering. What God complains about is his attitude. what's your attitude? It's like a monster crouching at your door. Well, thank you. I appreciate the chance to clarify that or muddy it, as the case may be, with the translation. But that's the best I could do with it. And I can assure you that out of at least 7 different commentaries I used preparing for this, everybody was having trouble with that, because it's, maybe something.
Is Hebrew much more difficult than Greek because there are no vowels or something?
Well, in the Masoretic text, we have vowels. And, when I'm translating, I use the Masoretic text because it's the most complete of the texts that we have. But the reason Hebrew is so difficult is because, if you look at the manuscripts we have, there are lots of, of words missing in some manuscripts. And so you're kind of piecing the puzzle together. And also, the reason Hebrew is more difficult is because it's word poor. It has a limited vocabulary. And so sometimes we're guessing at what things mean from the way they read in Akkadian or other Western Semitic languages or Ugaritic, and we're making educated guesses on the basis of other languages, even sometimes Arabic cognates. So the reason it's difficult is because we don't have quite as many resources as we do with Greek, and you don't have quite as many secular texts to compare with the sacred text. So your lexicon, your dictionary is smaller. And also, the other thing is that Hebrew has a lot more irregular verbs than Greek does, which means that words do funny things. So, like I was telling you about that word gah-BOH-ah, it's got 3 possible levels of meaning. And, all of them are kind of bad in the context, but which one is it? And what if it was a really critical word for the interpretation? That's a problem. So, yeah, so when you wonder why some translations read differently, that's why. And when sometimes people say the Hebrew text is difficult here, or the Hebrew text is obscure here, why they say that.
But even when you mentioned that, and I also saw one of the Chinese translations mentioned that the first verse of chapter 5 in the is the last verse of chapter 4 in the Hebrew.
Yes.
Well, that means the Hebrew people, they couldn't tell. That's a different. I mean, should that be a different? I mean, to us it seems to be very obvious with the
right.
Chinese or English translations, but in the original Hebrew, it wasn't clear to them. It's like a totally different, chapter. Of course, originally there were no chapters.
Well, to some copyists there may have been, but there weren't, there weren't identifiable chapters in the earliest texts. So chapters are relatively recent thing.
Yeah, I know they added that, they divided the chapters later, but when they did the chaptering, right? Why would that chapter 5 in our versions is belong to the previous chapter? I couldn't understand it.
Well, they must have assumed that this was a summary of what went before, but it's really better with what goes after. So but whoever did the chapter and versification, whichever rabbi or copyist did that, basically they were thinking, oh yeah, 17 is a good summary, but it's really a good kickoff.
Right. So it must be very difficult.
Yeah. That's for sure. Okay, well, God bless you all, and thank you for hanging in here. I'm
Very
gonna.
thankful that when with your sickness, you still hang on and prepare
Well,
and hang on with God.
I do whatever God gives me the strength to do. I'm sorry I was probably a little foggy tonight, but then again, I think the Lord may have given you what you need. So God bless you, and I'll make sure that I fulfill my stewardship by, finishing chapter 6 before the end of the week, even though you don't actually have to have it till next week for chapter 6. Okay, God bless you.